Each day as I enter my special education classroom, I become more aware of the disproportionate representation that exists in special education. Prior to doing the research for this project, I had accepted disproportionality with the mentality that this is just the way things are. I am now aware of the history of the issue that transcends the four walls of my classroom. The overrepresentation of culturally diverse students in special education has resulted in several well-known court cases. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was one of the earliest pieces of civil rights legislation in the United States that addressed disproportionate representation in special education. This piece of legislation banned discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. At this particular time in our nation's history, there were no federal or state mandates that required students with disabilities to be educated in the public school system. This act led to the creation of the Bureau of Education for the Handicapped. Today, this is known as the Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP. OSEP became a catalyst of change for people with disabilities, especially in the educational setting. OSEP is responsible for reporting the presence of disproportionate representation of minorities in special education in the annual report to Congress. OSEP also funds assistance to solve the ongoing issues of disproportionate representation in school districts across the nation. One of the best-known cases to challenge disproportionate representation was the case of Larry P. versus Riles. In 1979, African-American parents filed a court case against the state of California with the belief that the administration of culturally biased standardized IQ tests resulted in the disproportionate identification of African American children as mentally retarded, also known today as cognitively disabled. It was argued that African American students were being inappropriately placed in classroom settings that stigmatized them, provided them inadequate education, and limited their potential abilities. The outcome of this trial declared that IQ tests discriminated against African Americans and led to their overrepresentation, especially in the cognitively disabled category. In 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was authorized in order to provide students with disabilities free and appropriate public education. This act, unlike the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that was previously discussed, mandated school districts to provide education for students that would meet their current educational needs. After students with disabilities gained access to public education, federal concern arose relating to the educational experiences for students in special education that came from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. This concern led to several amendments to this act, most notably the amendments of 1997 and 2004. In the early 1990s, Congress reauthorized the Education for All Handicapped Children Act and changed the title to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also referred to as IDEA. In the 1997 reauthorization of IDEA, Congress noted the disproportionate representation of racial and ethnic minorities, which also acknowledged problems associated with misidentification and misclassification in schools across the nation. In the 2004 amendment to IDEA, educators also have the added responsibility to collect data in order to monitor and reduce disproportionality in special education. In order to ensure that all students would receive appropriate services, IDEA 1997 called for education professionals to administer appropriate assessments to all students. If a significant disproportionality exists, a revision of policies, procedures, and practices used in the identification and placement of students with disabilities must be completed in order to ensure there is compliance with IDEA. Local education agencies must report on these revisions and reserve a certain portion of funds to provide interventions Even after years of legislation, there continues to be disproportionality in special education classrooms across the country. The overrepresentation of African American students in learning disabilities classrooms is a pattern that has historical roots. In the latter half of the 1960s, there was a considerable amount of pressure on schools to stop labeling minority students as cognitively disabled. This concern led to the redefinition of the category cognitively disabled in 1973. Under the new definition, the highest IQ score that a student could receive to be labeled as cognitively disabled went from 1 standard deviation below the mean to 2 standard deviations below the mean. Many of the minority students who were or would have been labeled as cognitively disabled were now labeled as having a learning disability. In the years 1970 to 1977, a study was conducted analyzing the racial composition of learning disability classrooms in more than 50 school districts. According to this study by J. Tucker, Black students were underrepresented in learning disability classrooms until 1972. By 1974, after the redefinition of the cognitively disabled category, Blacks were overrepresented in the learning disabilities category. Looking at 2011 data gathered by the National Center for Learning Disabilities, one can see that the phenomenon of Black students being overrepresented in LD continues. Being a Wisconsin native and now a Minnesota resident, I specifically looked at the racial composition data for both Wisconsin and Minnesota. One can see in Wisconsin that the total percentage of Black students is 9.8%. But the percentage of Black students labeled as learning disabled is 13.9%. If we cross the border into Minnesota, we see the total percent of Black students is 9.2%, but the percent of Black students labeled as learning disabled is 14.8%. Education professionals are aware of the issue of disproportionality in special education programs across the nation. When looking at the data that suggests the perpetuation of this issue, a troubling conclusion that one may consider is the large number of struggling minority students that are being classified for special education. However, there are a number of steps that special educators can take to address or prevent disproportionality issues. Here are 3 recommended steps. Number 1, be part of open conversations. Instead of accepting the issue of disproportionality as just the way things are, educators should be engaging in continuous and courageous discussions on racial issues, culturally responsive instruction, and academic achievement of all students. During these discussions, one should be on the lookout for cultural biases that may contribute to high rates of special education referrals for minority students. Number 2, be data conscious. Many districts may have a disproportionality problem because there is little consideration for collected data through RTI or other interventions. Special education teachers are confronted with data daily and know how to not only interpret the data, but also how to take action based on what they are seeing. If special educators are part of conversations concerning data with general education colleagues and they sense biases, they can provide instructional support to general education teachers. This support may help general education teachers avoid making fixed judgments about students that can lead to misclassification. Number 3, be diligent in the evaluation process. Once students are referred and assessed for special education services, it is the job of special educators to ensure that the assessment process is completed in a way that is culturally responsive. The following questions are intended as prompts to uncover ways that special educators may have oversight that results in disproportionality. If any of those questions can be answered with a no, those questions can help special educators focus on and address areas that may be impacting the continuation of disproportionality.